In 1914, when the European powder keg finally ignited with one shot in Sarajevo, the world was plunged into war on a scale humanity had not yet seen, reaching around the globe from the fields and trenches of Europe to cities and towns half a world away. One such town, tucked away on the banks of the St. Lawrence, with a population at the time of only around 10,000, was Brockville, Ontario. Welcome to Facts and Fables. My name is Anna. Join us as we learn from our special guest, Brett Ayers, just how outsized an influence Brockville had on the world stage.
So World War I breaks out. Canada declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and that whole thing. Sam Hughes is the Minister of Defense at the time. Lieutenant Colonel William Buell was our commanding officer at the time. He immediately called up Sam Hughes and said, "Hey, we're ready to go. If you want the Brocs to participate, we're ready." At the time, though, there was policy in place from the government that said that militia and reserve units could not be used for overseas service. They could only be used in Canada for domestic operations or in the defense of Canada. So his offer was rejected. My understanding is he made the offer a few more times. It was continuously rejected until a letter was received by Lieutenant Colonel Buell, basically ordering him to report to Valcartier. I believe it was in September of 1914. So he reports to Valcartier in September of 1914, relinquishes his command and takes command of the 4th Division, Canadian Expeditionary Force. From that point on, the new commanding officer of the Brocs was Lieutenant Colonel Wilkinson. He essentially turned Brockville into a training center for people to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So Lieutenant Colonel Buell goes off with 4th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. Lieutenant Colonel Wilkinson takes command, sets up kind of an ad hoc training center for reinforcements for the Canadian Expeditionary Force in Brockville. So saw a lot of people come through here. Fall of 1915-ish, the idea started to float around of a Leeds and Grenville battalion for the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So essentially they would raise an entire battalion to then send overseas to serve, and this was called the 156. So if you ever see the 156 Canadian Expeditionary Force, the majority of that is from Leeds, Grenville, Brockville, like that area and around there. There's multiple companies set up for that. You had Alpha and Bravo companies came from Brockville, Gananoque, Lansdowne, Mallorytown, and they were quartered at the Brockville Fairgrounds.
Oh, okay.
Then you had Charlie Company came from Athens, Delta, Lyndhurst, Elgin, Newborough, and Westport. And they were trained in their own localities, so they were trained in their own areas and housed in their own areas, so they didn't have to relocate. So if you were in Prescott and you joined Alpha Company, you were sent to Brockville. Whereas if you joined Charlie Company because you were in Lyndhurst, you stayed in Lyndhurst, and you stayed in your own, you quartered with yourself essentially. From that point on, the 156 was raised, sent overseas, and effectively dispersed amongst all the units that were in France already. So essentially what ended up happening was members of the 156 would have been sent to any number of battalions. Some of them would have joined PPCLI, some of them would have joined RCR. They would have joined different divisions. So essentially the records we have indicate that the 156 never actually fought as its own fighting force. It was dispersed as reinforcements across the entire Western Front. From there, essentially until the end of the war, the 156 was there. That happened sometime in 1916. So I think what happened was the 156 was likely sending people to France all along. So they would train you up under the 156 colors, send you to England, and then you would be sent to France and dispersed from there. From there, the majority of Brocs were either with the 21st Battalion overseas, the 21st Battalion CEF, and essentially they would have fought in the battles like Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, which was the second battle of Ypres, Amiens, and basically the entire 100 Days Offensive from that point on would have involved Brock's as well.
All the major battles from that
Essentially,
era.
yeah. And so you can actually trace back to, because we started sending people over almost immediately, because there was already an established regiment in town. You can actually trace certain names into the early battles. So 13 Canadians that were from Brockville, or 13 Brocks, were killed in a gas attack at St. Julien in 1915.
And that's even before the major gas attack that most of people learn in school.
It was one of the first gas attacks in the entire First World War. Wow. So.
So then let's discuss the bravery from the Brocks at the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah, so the bravery of the Brocks at the Somme can be summed up in one particular name of Thane McDowell. Thane McDowell was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his conduct at the Somme. He ran out of ammo while they were attempting to take German machine gun nests. For most people, this would be problematic. For Thane McDowell, for some reason, it wasn't. And he leopard crawled up to the trenches, jumped in with suppressing fire from some of his fire team buddies. Out of ammo, proceeded to beat the German machine gunners to death, and then proceeded to take another 55 prisoner. In this process, he was shot in the hand and was sent back to England, where he was then awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his conduct at that battle.
And now that we're discussing Thane McDowell, I figured that we would go into what earned him the Victoria Cross.
Yeah, so it's a very similar, very similar story. I guess the Distinguished Service Order seemingly wasn't good enough for him. So he decided he had to kind of do it again. So at Vimy, after going to England and recovering from a gunshot wound to the hand from that incident that earned him the Distinguished Service Order, he gets back to France and joins his battalion at the front. And at the time, the battalion is preparing to attack Vimy. Vimy had been notoriously difficult for every other country to capture. The French had tried, the Brits had tried, the Aussies had tried. Essentially everybody except for the Canadians at this point had tried to take Vimy, and none of them had had any success at doing so. So the Canadians are preparing. Thane McDowell, he is there getting ready to go. Day of the battle comes. Thane McDowell and two runners get separated from their company somehow during the battle. In common Thane McDowell fashion, he says, "I don't care, we're going to carry on," with just three guys. He takes out two more German machine gun nests, this time with hand grenades, and sees a group of Germans running into a dugout into the side of the hill. And he decides he's going to chase them. He chases them down the dugout and turns a corner, and he sees 77 Germans staring back at him. And there's kind of this moment of pause, and they kind of look at each other. And Thane McDowell turns around and he says, "First company, second company, third company, I found them. Follow me and attack on my mark." Keep in mind, he only has three guys. He does not have three companies. It's him and two runners, two privates at that. All 77 Germans decide that they're going to surrender because they think that there is three companies of Canadians waiting for them. One of the biggest questions that gets asked is like, when they realized there was only three of them, how did they not, kind of change their mind and start fighting? So what McDowell did was he escorted them out 12 by 12. So he never escorted out more than 12 of them. So by only taking 12 people out, he was able to minimize the amount of people that they would have had to deal with when they realized there was only three guys and not three companies. So 12 by 12, they were marched back. One guy did try to fight. He was shot and killed as a result. But the rest of them were escorted back to the Canadian lines. And that is why he was awarded the Victoria Cross, because it was very likely one of the bravest things anybody had really seen to date, and he was one of only a couple of Victoria Cross winners that actually survived the entire war.
He was the only.
He was
to
the only
survive
one?
the war.
Okay.
He was one of 2 to survive Vimy.
Right, that's it. So.
But yeah, no, that's it's incredible bravery from Thane
Right.
McDowell. And from my understanding, he that bravery did come with a cost. He did suffer a lot afterwards.
Right.
Especially with the horrors of war and everything.
Right,
But
it's a shell shock. Yeah.
exactly. But then managed to live a very comfortable and happy life afterwards.
Yeah, he died in the Bahamas or something like that. Pretty nice spot to.
Right? It's a good spot to go,
Yeah.
especially for such a brave man.
Right.
And especially, but other men from the regiment, many men from the regiment, were not as lucky.
Anybody who's seen the movie 1917 is going to kind of know where Harry Brown's story goes, because that story is very. I won't say it's based off of him, because I know that Sam Mendes did not base it off of Harry Brown himself. He based it off of similar stories, because these stories happened all the time. Harry Brown was a member of the Canadian Mounted Rifles. He's from Gananoque. He was at the Battle of Hill 70, where essentially a German counterattack was expected. And had the Germans had the opportunity to counterattack at the time, Hill 70 would not have remained in Canadian hands, just because it was a depleted Canadian section that was holding it, or a depleted battalion that was holding the hill. And the men on Hill 70 knew that the counterattack was coming, but communication lines had been cut. So the HQ and the people responsible for sending reinforcements to Hill 70 had no way of knowing that this counterattack was happening. So command at Hill 70 sent 2 runners, Harry Brown and one other man who they still don't know his name. They sent him to let headquarters know, hey, there's this counterattack. If we don't get reinforcements, we're all gonna die, essentially, or the hill is gonna fall. So Harry Brown and this one other runner take off through no man's land under constant German fire, both artillery and harassing fire from the trench lines. Essentially, it's a very long run. I don't know the exact amount of time, but it was over a day that it took them to get there. Meanwhile, they're getting attacked from every angle possible. They're getting hit with artillery bombardments, and Harry actually loses his kind of his buddy, like his runner, the other runner that's with him. At this point, lots of broken bones, lots of injury, lots of shrapnel, but Harry kept going. He kept running. He had to get to HQ. I mean, at this point in time, there's a division that's on the line, and a lot of men are going to die if they don't get the reinforcements that they need. So Harry keeps going. He gets to the HQ, and essentially that's it. So he gets to HQ, he hands the letter and says, urgent message. He passes out, literally on the stairs to the dugout. He passes out, falls down the stairs, and he never wakes up. But his actions are credited with saving thousands and thousands of Canadian lives. And for that, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross.
Amazing. So that's a lot of Victoria Cross members that belong to the regiment, eh?
Yes, and a lot of Distinguished Service Order members that belong to the regiment as well. So it's significant. I mean, like the men who went from this regiment did a lot, like a lot, and it's not a huge area. So when you look at the numbers compared to an area like Toronto or a bigger city center. We didn't send as many people, obviously, as somewhere like Toronto or even Kingston would have sent. But the pound for pound, what was demonstrated by the men from this area who went was more often than not over the top bravery, and not a lot of people who were just guys over there. It was a lot of people who did something to distinguish themselves, whether it's Harry Brown or Thane McDowell or even Elmer Jones, any of those men, they did something exceptional in the war.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up Elmer Jones, because he's going to be who we're discussing next.
bar that he got on his second distinguished service order. Essentially, the dispatch reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, when a large enemy raiding party using Flammenwerfer, which is a flamethrower, entered his trench under cover of an intense barrage, he at once went forward under heavy fire and directed a counterattack, which re-established the line without the enemy having gained an identification. Later, under his direction, a raiding party entered the enemy's lines, captured some prisoners, and inflicted severe losses on the enemy. He displayed great resource and initiative." And that's on January 1st, 1917 that was gazetted.
Wow.
I don't know exactly what battle that would have been a part of. But, I mean, you're going up against somebody with a flamethrower. That's a war crime in today's world. That's pretty significant. The fact that you even think to do anything but hide in a hole is pretty spectacular. And so Elmer Jones was the commanding officer at the time of the 21st Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, which had a lot of people from Brockville, and was almost like a pseudo Brockville Rifles Battalion in France at the time. So all of the battle honors that we have, Amiens, Arras, the Hindenburg Line, and Mons, which are the battle honors that we currently hold from the First World War, 21st Battalion CEF participated in. Okay, so Lieutenant Colonel Jones at the time was the commanding officer for the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive. 100 Days Offensive began early August, I think it was August 8th, with the Battle of Amiens, which would also prove to be Lieutenant Colonel Jones' final battle. As his battalion advanced east of Amiens into Marcelcave, the smoke screen had been laid, and the front was advancing through a smoke screen, clearing trenches, clearing out machine gun nests. However, the nature of a smoke screen, they didn't see everything, so they couldn't clear everything, and they missed parts. So there were machine gun nests left. And as kind of the day ticked on and the fog from the overnight and the smoke screen started to lift, these German machine gun nests that had been missed by the front started to recognize that there were Canadians advancing right in front of them. And so they opened up. At this point, though, the HQ had kind of come up the rear to try and establish kind of a forward HQ that they could use as then a further step-off point for the remaining battles of this 100 Days Offensive that had kind of already been planned. So the Battle at Arras, Cambrai, Canal du Nord, and then push on into the Hindenburg Line. They wanted a forward HQ. And so when these German machine guns opened up on what otherwise would have looked like just another bunch of Canadians advancing, they actually opened up on the headquarters, and Lieutenant Colonel Jones was hit and passed away. The Sergeant Major for the battalion was also hit. He didn't pass away immediately. He passed away in the 20s. They attributed his death to the incident. However, it took some time for him to actually succumb to those injuries. So Lieutenant Colonel Jones was killed at Amiens, and essentially never got to see the end of the war, never got to see his 21st Battalion, which he had essentially commanded since the beginning of the war. He never got to see them kind of push through to the end.
Wow.
So the battalion command was handed over, and essentially that group of Brockville boys was commanded by a different person for the remainder of the war.
But they did push through until the end.
The 21st Battalion did. So the 21st Battalion continued on to Arras. Arras was a bit of a mess. A lot of casualties at the Arras trench line. It was the second battle of Arras, actually. So Arras had actually fallen earlier in the war when the Germans had actually been on their first offensive. So the second battle of Arras would have been the one that we participated in. We recaptured Arras again, like a very bloody battle. The Germans at this point, these were their last lines of defense before the Hindenburg Line, so they were really well fortified. A lot of logistical hubs kind of in this back area. So like Amiens was a big logistical hub. Arras was a big logistical hub. So they're very protective of these. Again, like the Canadians though the Canadians were using more artillery than they had ever used at this point. And essentially it was a plan that overwhelmed the Germans, and lots of casualties were happening, but the Germans just could not handle the just sheer determination of the Canadian battalions at this point. So once Arras had fallen, they continued to advance east. Other towns on the kind of that western front, like Cambrai, and then pushing to Canal du Nord, and then onto the Hindenburg Line, which was another battle under the Brockville. And the story of the Hindenburg Line is actually really kind of interesting, because the Hindenburg Line, like, there had been attempt after attempt to take the Hindenburg Line early in the war, and now again at this point during the 100 Days Offensive. You know, the Hindenburg Line was this like heavily fortified and very well defended line of bunkers, trenches, barbed wire, concertina wire, mines, like, you know, machine gun nests. Essentially, it was a death trap, and what the Germans would do is they would funnel you in by setting up obstacles. So they'd funnel you into these killing zones at the Hindenburg Line. And so Sir Arthur Currie at the time he was very cognizant of the fact that this had been, you know, essentially from the time they'd stepped off from at Amiens until they were ready to take the Hindenburg Line, there had been a lot of casualties. It had not been fun for the Canadians, and morale was very fragile. And she was very cognizant of that before he kind of ordered the attack on the line. So he was looking for, I would say, probably the path of least resistance to get the Hindenburg Line to fall. And the way that what he had kind of come up with was that the Hindenburg Line was kind of in the shape of almost an L. And in northern France, there was this bridge kind of at the edge of the Hindenburg Line. And it's kind of funny, actually, when you look at it in hindsight. But the Germans thought, like, the German high command thought, there's no way the Canadians are stupid enough to go across the bridge. There's no chance. It's a choke point. They're just going to assume that we're going to have it so heavily defended that there is zero chance that they will go across the bridge. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, Sir Arthur Currie says they think that we're too stupid to go across the bridge, so they're not going to defend the bridge, so we're going to go across the bridge. So Sir Arthur Currie orders the Canadians across the bridge to the north of the Hindenburg Line. Almost no resistance, and they roll up the Hindenburg Line from the inside. Obviously, the rolling up of the Hindenburg from the inside wasn't as easy as crossing the bridge. It was a lot of fighting and a lot of bloody battles that took place as they attempted to do that. But essentially, the Brockville Rifles participated in that, and in the collapse of the Hindenburg Line, that was one of the biggest keys, because you had these frontal assaults happening on these killing zones that the Germans had established. Meanwhile, you had an attack coming from the rear. So essentially, the Germans were encircled on the Hindenburg Line, and it kind of folded like bread. And so from that point on, the Germans were on the run. Now, when we say the Germans were on the run, they didn't turn their backs and run. The rear guard fought like hell. And essentially, there's a saying, and I don't know who said it, but the saying is, it's a bloody long way to Mons. And Mons is a town in Belgium. So if you're following like the north of France, right? North of France goes into Belgium. Mm-hmm. So we had crossed the Hindenburg Line, and now we're pushing into Belgium. We're pushing the Germans back through Belgium. Mons had been one of the first towns that the Germans had taken in the First World War, and they had held it the entire war. And so it was a very important town. It was important logistically, but it was also important kind of mentally, as being like, hey, you know, like, at least we have Mons. And so the thinking of the Canadian High Command at the time and Sir Arthur Currie was that we can't let the Germans keep Mons. We knew the war was ending. They knew the war was coming to an end. But they could not let the Germans keep Mons, because if they let the Germans keep Mons, then the Germans are going to be able to twist this as we negotiated a peace, and we still have something, as opposed to it being kind of full military defeat. So essentially the Canadians are chasing the Germans back to Mons. The Germans don't want to give up Mons, so they're kind of falling back to Mons to try and hold it. And essentially the entire time, snipers, machine gun nests, artillery barrages, they're launching everything they can at the Canadians. And at this point too, you have to remember the Canadians knew the end of the war was coming. This has been a war that had been fought for every inch. Like, people were dying for an inch of land. And now all of a sudden you have Canadians advancing 20, 30 miles a day across, France and Belgium. So, they know that the Germans are running. They know that the war is coming to an end. So the people who are fighting, they don't want to die because they know that the war is about to end. So life almost became more important now than it was in the middle of the war, or even like a month earlier before, or 2 months earlier before the 100 Days Offensive had even started. Life had become more important. And so the Germans fought tooth and nail, tooth and nail, tooth and nail. Eventually, the Canadians had Mons encircled, and that was when the armistice was signed. Germany had surrendered. November 10th, I think, was the day. November 10th was the day that Mons had been captured, and November 11th was when the armistice was signed.
So you can almost say that the Canadian military almost psychologically broke the Germans in Mons.
Yeah, the argument is definitely that, and it's not even really an argument. I would say that if you look at the Canadians' role in the 100 Days Offensive, you had an American military that was very inexperienced and had not been there. The Americans joined the war late, and yes, they had a ton of manpower. However, they didn't have the experience in trench warfare in that brutal war of attrition, and so they made a lot of mistakes. They struggled very early on in the war. They struggled, or not very early on, but very early on in their involvement in the war, the Americans struggled. I would say the best analogy is that the Canadians kind of pushed that first domino over, where others had struggled to push that domino over. And Amiens is kind of case in point. I mean, it was a very important town for the Germans. When they lost Amiens, it's actually, the Battle of Amiens is described in Germany. It's described as the Black Day of the German Army, because it was such a embarrassing defeat on their part. I mean, again, like, keep in mind what I said earlier. Like, the war was fought every inch. Like, people died for every inch of land in the First World War. And then you had, in Amiens, I think the Canadians had advanced like 22 kilometers by the end of the first day. And you had a war that had previously been fought for every inch. And, it had been it was essentially like, who's going to survive longer? And now you had the Canadians essentially chasing the Germans across no man's land. And, back through France and back into Belgium, and then back in Belgium, back out to Germany. So you had that kind of first domino. Once the Germans were on the run, they were on the run. And morale just continued to get lower in the German army, whereas it was never really high in the Canadian army, but the Canadians and, the broader Allied forces could kind of see the war coming to an end, and obviously that has a bit of a positive impact on morale. So, you kind of have the Canadians pushing that first domino to say, like, hey, they're starting to fall, and then you had everybody kind of dogpiling on behind to get behind. So it's like when they say the First World War was really like the birth of Canada as a nation, it comes down to that. Like, you look at the end of the war, I'd say the Canadians can take a fair bit of credit for ending the war at the time, because the Allied Supreme Commander, or the Supreme Allied Commander, Ferdinand Foch, who was a French general, he anticipated the war was going to continue into 1919 and even possibly 1920 at the current rate. And then Sir Arthur Currie comes out with this plan to launch this series of quick attacks that we now obviously know as the 100 Days Offensive, and that effectively ended the war. So, yeah, you can definitely say that the Canadians played one of the largest roles in ending that war.
You were discussing that we definitely were not angels during this war.
No, and and there's a reason for it too, because
exactly.
particularly as the end of the war was kind of approaching, again, like, you could see it happening. Like, the people who were fighting could see it. They could see that the Germans were terrified. They were turning and they were running. They were dropping everything and just going. Like, there's pictures at the Battle of Arras of the Canadians with something nuts, like 175 artillery guns, and then a bunch of rifles and a bunch of machine guns that the Germans just left. They didn't try and carry them. They didn't destroy them. They didn't do anything. So essentially these weapons were turned and used against the Germans in the grand scheme of things. But, people could see that the end of the war was near. And then you had these isolated pockets, particularly after the Hindenburg Line fell. You had these isolated pockets of this incredibly fierce fighting that was perpetuated by the Germans, and these groups of Germans who did not want to accept that they were losing the war. And so you had Canadians who were watching their friends die when the war was very clearly over from our side, and it was just a matter of time for the German government to get the Kaiser to kind of get his crap together enough to say, like, hey, we're done. So you had Canadians seeing friends and guys who they had kind of fought all along with, even in some cases prior to the 100 Days Offensive, guys who had fought at the Somme together, Vimy together, Hill 70 together, like all these different battles that there's recorded history of these guys being a part of. And now all of a sudden they're going to die in the last 2-3 weeks of the war because of an isolated pocket of German soldiers that just can't accept that the war's going to die. So ultimately what would happen is when these guys were taken prisoner, they generally weren't taken prisoner. Even in Band of Brothers, which obviously is Hollywoodized of the Second World War, but you even see it, like, you don't get close to reinforcements until they've been there for at least a month, because 95% of the time they're coming in and they're dying within a week. So these guys had seen so much death and at the hands of the other side that there was just no real remorse for the other side at this point in time, particularly, like I said, particularly at the end of the war. Earlier on in the war, absolutely, where it wasn't as obvious who was going to win, but you had, like I said, there's isolated pockets that had really heavy fighting basically from the time the Hindenburg Line fell all the way back to Mons. You had isolated pockets of extreme fighting, and essentially people were tired of seeing their friends die, and now they're seeing their friends die almost needlessly, while they're waiting essentially for the German Kaiser to basically be abdicated and there to be an armistice negotiated. So.
Well, and this would have been a particularly vicious war. I mean, it's not just being killed by the other side, but it's also the other side not going down, and then you're also dealing with people who are sick with trench foot.
Spanish flu.
Exactly, Spanish flu at the time. So it would have been ripping through, and they would have been like, let's just end this war, and unfortunately, you're only human.
Right. So the Spanish flu played a huge role in the downfall of the Germans too. It was really ripping through the Germans kind of through September, October, November of 1918. So, you had your trench foot, and particularly following the collapse of the Hindenburg Line, there had been a lot of rain, and so as the Canadians were advancing to Arras, it took a really long time. There was a lot of sunken roads, a lot of choke points that the Germans were just ambushed the Canadians at, and the Canadians were slow because they had these massive 18-inch guns that they were trying to tow through mud, essentially. And it doesn't take you very long watching your First World War movie to see a truck stuck in mud. I think that is one of the pictures or one of the mental images that can kind of, I think it kind of resonates with most World War I stories, is just how muddy and gross it was, and particularly during that final push to Mons, it was particularly muddy. So, you had everybody was soaking wet, everybody was covered in mud, and they were moving slowly. Everybody was cranky. Everybody had been, well, not everybody, but a lot of guys had been fighting for multiple years. It was just kind of a perfect storm of bad stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, and it's only what humans psychologically
Yeah.
can handle, and they can
Right.
only be pushed so far until at some point, especially when you're faced with something that's keeping you in those conditions,
Right.
that you snap.
Right. Right. And so you had, a lot of people came home from the war and just never recovered.
On November 11th, 1918, the Armistice Agreement was signed, officially ending humanity's first global industrial conflict. When the smoke cleared, 20 million people, half of them civilians, were gone, and another 21 million were wounded. 66,000 of the dead were Canadians, along with 172,000 of the wounded. Their sacrifices and victories gained Canada global recognition, earning them a separate signature on the Treaty of Versailles. Those who were fortunate enough to return home to Brockville did so bearing scars, both physical and mental. On Friday, May 28th, 1924, a monument was unveiled before Brockville's courthouse to honor those who served. Special thanks to Brett Ayers and the Brockville Rifle Society for making this video possible. Thank you for watching.